The champs are coming to town, but are the Celtics still the class of the league? I'm Mike Sherman, sports editor, and this is the NBA in OKC with Mike Baldwin. Mike, one of the marquee games of the season happens Wednesday at the Ford Center when the Boston Celtics come to town. One thing, we're 1 week into the season, and here it is. The question I have, first of all, is, are these Celtics the Celtics of last year? Are the champs still the champs?
Well, they've got everybody but Posey, so over the long term you'd think. But a lot of people, a lot of times, are they as hungry? Do they work as hard? Because all those guys wanted a championship in their other places. Ray Allen, Garnett, Minnesota, Allen out in Seattle, now the Thunder. They all came together. I mean, they really were on a mission and a goal. And you see it a lot of times, veteran players come together. So a lot of people want to get into the hunger factor. But they're still the favorites in the East. But they're showing early in the season that maybe they are a little more vulnerable than last year, and they won't get near 66 wins again. But they're still one of the best teams in the league because of the three All-Stars. But Indiana showed in their win last Saturday in Indianapolis that they can be beat, especially by younger teams that run, and that's what everybody's expecting the Thunder to try to do, play good defense, rebound, kick it out, and go. And so they're a little more vulnerable. And the other factor that we're learning already, me first year on the NBA beat, is these back-to-back games. Everybody says is a big deal because the second night you lose energy, especially back-to-back road games. They're in Houston Tuesday night against a team they'll want to make an impression against. Houston's undefeated. Houston's one of those teams people think may be a title contender if they can stay healthy. So I got a feeling the Celtics will pour a lot of energy in that game and then come to the Ford Center the next night against one of the lower teams in the league. So I think it's definitely a game that the Thunder, if they play well, especially defensively, to lead what they do best and run, they may have a shot at an upset here.
Let's go back to the Indiana game. Two things that happened in Indiana late last week is the Pacers ran the ball at them. They got T.J. Ford at point guard, a point guard who pushes up tempo. Danny Granger, guy who just signed a big multi-year deal, their best player, he loses 2 teeth in a collision with Paul Pierce, scrambling for a loose ball, knocks out his 2 front teeth the day after signing a big contract. That's the kind of effort the Pacers used to beat them. They were up 25 points at one point, and the Celtics really never challenged. Can the Thunder come out and do it with energy and emotion and defense tonight?
I think they definitely got a shot. That's the thing we're talking about, is they're catching them at a good time. The crowd will be stoked. It'll probably be one of the best crowds of the year. The players are already bragging about the crowd. I definitely think they've got a shot, but they got to play well on the defensive end, and that's where it gets started, so we'll find out right there.
Okay, in the NBA, looking up, the big news this week is the blockbuster trade between the Denver Nuggets and the Detroit Pistons. The Nuggets sent Allen Iverson to Detroit. In return, they get Chauncey Billups and Antonio McDyess. What's behind that trade, Mike?
Well, I think it's one of those win-win for both team situations. Is a lot of people feel like Nuggets were maybe a 9-10 team outside the playoffs in the West. So everybody's looking at what does AI bring Detroit, because that's the glamour player, the future Hall of Famer, all that. But I think a lot of people feel like Chauncey Billups will bring them a better point guard for their needs. That means run the offense, kick and dish, because you already had a scorer, in Melo, the guy that everybody around here is familiar with his run to the NCAA title that year. And then you also, the McDyess factor we'll see. And then for Detroit, of course, they lack that one thing. They lack somebody getting in the lane. They lack somebody that can create on their own. They had everything but that here in recent years, and they've been a quality team that won a title not so long ago, but they feel like that's the missing piece for them. So both teams went with this really thinking this will help us, because some people said the Nuggets may tear it down and build. I don't think so. I think this trade is we're going to try to make a run at the playoffs this year by taking away one of our stars and adding somebody we think fits our team better. And he's a hometown guy. Remember, he grew up in Denver. He went to Colorado nearby. That sometimes fuels a guy to even bring his A game.
Both of them are up in years. Billups is more of a defender, coming from the Pistons, where they built their whole culture and their whole tradition around winning basketball defensively. The other interesting thing about this is what it does in Denver. It gives them, as you said, a true point guard, but it means J.R. Smith. Remember him, guys? J.R. Smith, formerly of the New Orleans/Oklahoma City Hornets, more shots. But now all of a sudden he's going to play all the time at shooting guard, which he was sharing a little time with Allen Iverson there. That's a different place. So that's going to be interesting to watch the transformation of this Nuggets team, which Stephen A. Smith of ESPN picked the Nuggets to win the NBA title last year. They really underachieved, really disappointed. You're right, it's one more run at it for the Nuggets. Mike, are there any other trades boiling out there? I know it's early, but are there any other trades sort of bubbling beneath the surface?
Well, I mean, like we've talked, there's Al Harrington, some other guys may be on the block, but this was unusual. I mean, in pro sports, you very rarely see a trade in the season. Now, maybe late in training camp, they've seen what they've had a few preseason or exhibition games. They say, this is where we want to fix it. That's why this was a little off the wall. You don't see this very often. More times than not, most most of the trades around February at the trading deadline. There may be another one here in the next month or two, but I don't just expect a rash of trades early in the season. Most people went through training camp. This is our roster. They want to see what they have for a while, and I definitely think that's the case with the Thunder, which we talked about.
Well, two things, two deals I know that are out there. It's a matter if there are any takers. Al Harrington and the Golden State Warriors are ready to part ways. A 6'10" forward who really is more comfortable playing with his face to the basket rather than his back to the basket. Who wants a 6'10" three-point shooter? That's the question. With a big money contract, his old team, Indiana, has sort of changed around. Donnie Walsh, who was with him in Indiana, drafted him in Indiana, is now with the Knicks. Talk that Harrington might end up with the Knicks. You know, whenever you're talking trades, it's always like, hey, the Knicks might get him. In some ways, they're the Oakland Raiders of the NBA. Another interesting deal out there is Stephon Marbury, speaking of the Knicks. They're maybe just going to buy him out at some point. So neither of those guys are people who the Thunder might be interested in. But there are some people, at least a couple, that maybe the Thunder might have a little interest in. Do you see them making any moves?
Well, I think Presti has said from the get-go since he got to town is we're building this slowly, something that will last. And so I think the number one thing is he wants to see what he has, mainly out of his young guys like Durant, Westbrook, Green, some of those guys. He brought in a couple veterans in Mason and Smith to help the chemistry. You already had Carlson, you had Weezy, Chris Wilcox. So I think he wants to let this team play for a couple months. Their defense has already looked a little better in the early going. That's an encouraging sign. The offense hasn't looked as good. So I think they want to give them at least a good 6 to 8 weeks to see what they have. Now, what they do in February, like he did last year, remember, I mean, he was the guy that got a couple picks in February, a couple other teams. I think they may do something, whether it's trade a Wilcox or trade a Smith, who knows. Or maybe they're playing better than they thought and they don't want to mess with that chemistry because they are building for the future and they don't get as much back in return. But, I mean, Sam has shown he will pull the trigger, but I don't see him doing anything before Christmas. He'll probably be going up until the February deadline. He might do something then.
Here's a low-cost option out there. Morris Allman, a guy most people never heard of, like a third shooting guard for the Utah Jazz. Morris Allman has connections to this front office. One, Sam Presti was in San Antonio when Allman worked out with the Spurs, left the draft workout in 2006 or 7, thinking, hey, the Spurs are going to take me. They didn't. He ended up with the Jazz. There's a GM, assistant GM now for the Thunder, who was with Utah before this. They know Mo Allman. He's a shooter. Whether he's a prolific shooter, but he is a guy that would be a growth stock, somebody you take. And so it just, in some ways it matters, do they match up? How much does Utah want? They declined to give him their third-year option. So basically they said, you're still on our team, but we're not keeping you past this year. Everything out of Utah says it's time for those two parties to move on. It'd be interesting to see. Here's a shooter with potential. Do they go out and try to get a shooter? Mike, here's another question, though, as we look this next week beyond the Celtics. The next 3 games, interestingly enough, Utah Friday, home Sunday against the Atlanta Hawks, a young team that made the turn into the playoffs last year, and then Monday at Indiana. 2 of those 3 teams, playoff teams last year, 2 of the 3, young teams. Give us a sneak peek for those 3.
Well, one thing next week is they play 5 games, 7 days, their worst week of the season. So we're going to see about this young team and their legs overall starting Sunday night with the Atlanta game. Let's start with that one. They do. With Josh Smith and some young guys, they made the playoffs. They're one of those teams. I didn't have them in the playoffs in my preseason projections. I may have aired early from what little I've seen early. They're off to a good start. They got a good young team. They only had 37 wins, which wouldn't have got them close to the playoffs in the West, but they look a little bit better. They're one of those teams that when you show up at the Ford Center, the Atlanta Hawks, whatever, you show up, it'll be a fun athletic team to watch. Utah, they may be Thursday night, we'll be watching on TV. Darnell, of course, will be out in Salt Lake, but they're catching them at the right time. Darren Williams still probably will not be playing. He had that early season injury, maybe sideline him a week or 2 weeks. If you're going to catch the Jazz on the road, arguably the best home team in the league. I mean, they only lost 4 games last year at home, 37-4. You want to catch them when Darren Williams may be sidelined. So it'll still be an upset, even if they can beat them without Darren, but that's catching them at a good time. And let's see, the other one you put on there,
Indiana
Monday is a team similar to the Thunder in a way that they're rebuilding. They got some young pieces, but they're not even close to the old Pacer days, you know what I mean? And so that's one of those, can you go steal a road win? You're going to need a few of those to get to that 30-win mark that some people said would be a magical season if you can improve by at least 10 wins. These are the kind of teams from the East. You got the Knicks not too far behind that. You got to steal one or two of those from teams on the road on the East, because you're not going to win a lot of road games, but to win some, these are the kind. Indiana's favored, but that's one of those, if you play well that night, you might have a chance to pull an upset.
For the home crowd, it is the Boston Celtics Wednesday night at the Ford Center, and the next time you see the Thunder in downtown Oklahoma City is against the Atlanta Hawks, who gave the Celtics fits last year in the Eastern Conference before eventually bowing out. Mike, thanks. Hey, listen, to follow all the news and analysis on the Thunder and the NBA, stay with us at newsok.com, newsok.tv, and every day in the new look, Oklahoma.